Andy McCarthy, it's so great to see you again. On one hand, Andy, the nuclear codes. On the other hand, do you think maybe that these documents were planted on President Biden? That's the words, essentially, if I characterize the mainstream media, over our two big news events over the last 6 months when it comes to classified documents. When it comes to President Trump and Mar-a-Lago, we're selling the nuclear codes to Russia. When it comes to Joe Biden, according to Congressman Hank Johnson, they might have been planted. When you, in all seriousness, look at these two, and we'll go to the details of President Biden's news in just a moment, but when you see these two issues side by side, what, if any, do you see as major differences between Trump and Biden?
I think, Will, that, they always talk about differences of degree and differences of kind, right? So I don't see any difference in kind, which is the most important thing for a prosecutor, because you're always talking about differences of degree of evidence and degree of guilt. But essentially what you're talking about is the same behavior that would be covered by the same statutes. And, it seems to me that the most important comparison is the one that sets the context for this whole thing, but has been kind of lost in these comparisons between Biden and Trump. And that's Hillary Clinton, who committed an egregious offense that was years long and very willful and got a complete pass. So if you're the Justice Department looking at this, going into the Trump investigation, no matter how bad you think that behavior is, you have a very thin margin of error in trying to explain that he's so uniquely awful that he should be prosecuted, even though Hillary Clinton was not prosecuted by the Obama-Biden Justice Department. And I don't think you could afford any big slip-ups. And then to have the president, the sitting president of the United States, the vice president of the administration that opted not to prosecute Hillary, end up committing essentially the same offense that Trump is accused of committing. I just don't see how it can be viable.
Wow. So a couple of things I want to process and dive into there. So let's stick on the distinction between difference in degree and difference in kind. Right. When you say there's not a difference in kind, but there might be a difference in degree, do you mean that by the number of documents potentially that were held and should not have been held outside of classified containment? So the number you hear when it comes to Trump and Mar-a-Lago is 300. I don't have a number on Biden right now. I think it sounds around about a dozen right now. But is that what you're talking about when you say a difference of degree?
That's one aspect of it. The important aspect of Trump that's a big difference. And in fact, Will, you've probably noticed in the last 48 hours, the Democrats' rhetoric has changed markedly on Trump. They're now no longer talking about document retention and classified information. They're talking about subpoenas from the grand jury and obstruction. So the thing with the Trump situation that's most different from Biden, other than the breadth of documents, and I don't even want to make a judgment about that yet, because as you just pointed out, we don't really even know how many Biden documents there are. But let's assume, for argument's sake, that it's less than 20 and that Trump had 300. That's only one aspect of it. Trump fought the government for about a year, close to a year, before, when the National Archives threatened to bring the matter to Congress, he finally surrendered 15 boxes. And in the 15 boxes, the archives find classified information, which is why they refer to the Justice Department. And everybody's pleading with Trump to give this stuff back. He won't give it back. He says basically it's his stuff, which is not, that used to be the law before the 1970s. It's not the law now. And it got to the point where the Justice Department issues a grand jury subpoena. And then Trump says, okay, we've collected up all the stuff, come and get it. And in June, they present a package to the FBI and the Justice Department. In lieu of having to show up at the grand jury with this, they accept the package, but they want a sworn statement, just like you'd have to testify if they actually put you in the grand jury, right? A sworn statement that says we've done a meticulous, extensive search, and this is all the documents that he has retained. So they give him that statement, and that statement turns out to be false. I don't want to say that it's a lie because we don't know the circumstances and who knew what when it was signed, but it looks terrible, right? So it's false information that's given to the grand jury, and that when they get other information that he still has documents there, which apparently came from witnesses, gives them enough evidence to go get a search warrant, which is why they get the search warrant. So you're talking about like an 18-month process where he fought them tooth and nail and arguably lied to the grand jury. Whereas with Biden, you're not only talking about fewer documents, but apparently when they found them, they self-reported that they had done it. They turned them over immediately to the National Archives, and they say they're cooperating with the investigation. So far we don't have any reason to believe they're not. So those are the differences in degree. But when I say there's no difference in kind, at the end of the day, the offense is mishandling classified information. And what astonished me today is that Biden has copped to it, essentially. I mean, what came out today was basically a guilty plea.
Okay. So I want to come back. I'm going to do this piece by piece for my own understanding, Andy, and I'm going to come back to difference in kind or the lack of a difference in kind in just a moment. I want to stay on degree. Okay, so what I hear right now it's interesting you say what we're talking about is mishandling of classified documents. You're right. But the reason to start out with the differences between Trump and Biden and to focus on degree is because we're really also talking about hypocrisy and the way these types of things are handled, not just by the media, but perhaps by the DOJ. All right. So you have highlighted at least two differences in degree right now. One, Trump fought for 18 months. Biden submitted immediately. And that can or cannot play in Biden's favor. I'm not sure when that's a positive or a negative for Biden, because you point out it's in essence an admission of guilt by Biden. So that's a difference. The second difference, which you and I both should wave our hand at right now, is we don't know the number of documents. So we could say 300 versus 12 or 300 versus 20. We don't know. But I want to explore one other element of the difference in degree, and that is all of the accusations of Trump's mishandling of classified documents revolve around him having them at Mar-a-Lago. And right now it appears that Joe Biden at least had them in two separate locations, and possibly three. The presidential library, or vice presidential library, is the Penn Biden Library, his garage where he keeps his Corvette. And then he says, talking about his admission here, also, he says his personal library. And people don't know, I don't know, Andy, maybe you do. Does that mean the library in the house where the garage and the Corvette were stored and there were some more documents in that personal library? Or is it an entirely third new location? So in terms of a difference of degree, it does seem Trump may have had more, we don't know, in one location. Biden has them scattered over several locations.
Well, I don't think that's quite accurate. I mean, first of all, at Mar-a-Lago is a big estate and resort, right? So they had him in multiple locations in Mar-a-Lago, mainly the storage locker and also his office, which are separate locations. We don't know whether stuff was moved around in the interim. I think the Justice Department suspects that. Then the other thing, Will, is around Thanksgiving, the Trump team self-reported that they had tried to do a thorough investigation of all his different locations, like Bedminster and Trump Tower in New York, or, all his different places that he goes. And they found two documents in a property locker in Palm Beach, which is near to, but not on the premises of, Mar-a-Lago, where the government shipped about 6 pallets of stuff that Trump wanted sent from Washington to Florida when he left the White House. So you're talking basically 2 documents out of 6 pallets of stuff. They went through everything and found these 2 documents. I should point out also, Will, since we're talking about how, disparate treatment by the Justice Department, Biden's been praised by Democrats for the last several days because he self-reported, right? On Thanksgiving, when Trump self-reported, the way the Justice Department reacted was on December 8th, they marched into federal court and asked for Trump to be held in contempt for defying the grand jury subpoena. So again, I think that it's fair to raise that as a difference in treatment. Yeah.
Okay. So So wrapping up degree, Andy, I hear you saying it's not a difference of degree now necessarily that they had them in multiple different locations. Both Biden and Trump satisfied that potential guilt. Scope, we'll see. We don't know the number of documents. The way they approached this, Trump fought it. You point out that Biden came forward, but also, and I don't know if this is legally important or if it's just politically important, but that the Biden administration seemed to be aware of this, or the DOJ seemed to be aware of this, right? While they were still making statements about how abhorrent it is what Trump did, and also while they were appointing a special counsel to Trump. Am I right, Andy? They were already aware that Biden might also be in violation of these very same sins. Yeah,
that's one of the infuriating things about this, Will, is the timeline. So they initially find out that Biden has mishandled these documents on November 2nd. They don't say anything about it before the midterms, which is 6 days later. They don't say anything about it before November 18th when Garland appoints the Trump special counsel, even though there's no real apparent conflict of interest between the Biden Justice Department having to investigate a Republican. That sort of thing goes on all the time. The conflict of interest is the Biden Justice Department having to investigate Biden. And on that score, they should have appointed a special counsel 2 years ago in connection with what they call the Hunter Biden investigation to obfuscate the fact that Joe Biden is the main concern in the investigation, right? So, yes, you have all these situations where the Justice Department had to have been aware that they had this situation with Biden, and yet they didn't make public disclosure in a timely way, and they made all these decisions with respect to Trump that certainly the Biden situation should have borne on, and yet they acted like it hadn't happened.
All right. So in my personal estimation right now, I don't see great differences in degree until I know the number of documents, which could be a differentiating factor. I don't think Biden deserves a ton of credit for coming forward versus Trump fighting back. The fight was held openly, and the coming forward was somewhat held in secret. So I don't see any great virtue on either side in a matter of degree. I want to go to kind now, differences in kind. And I don't think you and I ever had an opportunity, Andy, to have a conversation during the Mar-a-Lago raid and the discussion about Trump's classified documents. I see, and I defer to you and your legal expertise, of course, I see a difference in kind in this respect. And I know that you and I have known each other for a long time. While we might not have spoken in the last 6 months, we've known each other for, a decade. And I do remember you've been a pretty strong proponent, I believe, for a strong executive. So I don't know how that plays into this. Right. But there is an argument the president has the power to declassify. Now, what hurdles and forms and requirements may be there can be discussed, but the president has the ultimate power to declassify. So at some level, President Trump does have the ability to say, I declassified these documents. It's a difference in kind to me, that isn't it? Biden was vice president. He wouldn't have had that same power. He can't even make that same argument that these are unprotected documents. I declassified them.
Well, it becomes a difference in kind, Will, only if Trump exercised the authority that you're talking about in a timely way. So I think everybody would agree his ability to declassify documents at will ended at noon on January 20th of 2021.
Yes.
So if he didn't declassify the documents before that point in time, then he can't declassify them afterwards. And then the other problem I think you have there is that the Presidential Records Act requires that when presidents do official presidential business, they're supposed to document it in writing. So if Trump did declassify these documents, there's got to be a writing someplace. And so far, nobody's produced it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm a skeptic.
Okay. And Andy, look, I eminently respect your legal opinion, and I'm curious, do you believe that is a constitutional legal requirement that the president has to document his declassification of certain documents? I do believe, Andy, and I'm stretching out over time now, that a president divulging information in essence declassifies it, or at least there's been an argument made as such, that if a president takes classified information and shares it with me or you, who is not within the classification hierarchy, he has in effect declassified that document. The classification is meant to protect lower people from understanding information they shouldn't have, and the president has the ultimate authority to share that information. So I'm just curious, in your estimation, how encumbered is a president on legal formalities in declassifying documents versus simply, these are now declassified because I've shared them?
Yeah, I think the courts so far, Will, have held that unless you dot the I's and cross the T's, the information's not declassified. And this has come up in connection with, for example, Trump making some statements on Twitter where people argued that, in effect, that declassified a whole range of information and they should be able to get it under the Freedom of Information Act. And the court said, no, if you haven't followed the formal steps. Now, it's fair enough to say, well, maybe that applies to people moving under FOIA, but it doesn't apply to the president himself. But there's two avenues of constitutional authority that are relevant here, right? There's the president's authority, and then there's the authority of Congress to pronounce standards by which, things have to be done. And I think a court would probably say the president has absolute authority to declassify what he wants to declassify, but Congress has authority to set the terms under which the form that you have to go through to declassify them. And I imagine that if that question gets to the court, and one of the reasons you might not want to indict Trump is you'd have to litigate this kind of stuff. He would be a different defendant than they've ever had in a case before, because as you're pointing out, he was president. So he has these reservoirs of authority and privilege that the normal person doesn't have. They'd have to litigate that. But I would think that the courts would probably find it would not be an interference of a material nature in the president's constitutional authority to respect Congress's authority to prescribe the conditions under which the president declassifies.
Okay, so let's move forward with this now. So the story that we can pursue, and we have pursued to some extent, is a story of hypocrisy, but a story of actual malfeasance from a high-level government official. How significant, and I think this can bring us back to your point about Hillary Clinton, how significant is this story in terms of, I guess, its potential impact on Joe Biden's presidency? But I think when I hear you invoking Hillary Clinton and scope and the lack of interest in pursuing that from the Department of Justice, what we're also talking about is what type of impact do these two cases side by side have on Americans' trust of the DOJ?
Yeah, it's a big question, and where it leads us to, and I don't mean this, I'm kind of almost contradictory in this way. I made a point of distinguishing kind and degree.
Yes.
What I should also have said is that in every decision a prosecutor has to make about whether to bring cases, there's always two questions that have to be answered. One is, do you have sufficient evidence that a rational jury could find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt on the offense that you've charged? So that goes to the sufficiency of the evidence. That's always a question. The second question is, even assuming the answer to the first question is yes, that you do have a sufficient case, does a prosecution serve the public interest, or is it outweighed by other public interests that cut against a prosecution? And I think all of the things that you're now raising, including, the Hillary Clinton precedent, the manner in which the Justice Department has gone about this, have they provided equal protection under the law, which they're required to do constitutionally? And more importantly to me, because this is what I hear from people when I go around the country and talk about criminal justice issues, the country's on fire over our two-tiered justice system and the perception that the quality of justice that you get depends on what your political affiliation is. And if you're going to handle this kind of an investigation in a way that is going to exacerbate that problem, that significantly cuts against bringing charges in a case like that. It just does. And then the last thing I point out, I don't mean to filibuster here, but, in 2016 and 2020, we've had cycles where law enforcement intruded into our politics in a corrupt manner and really tried to put its thumb on the scale in a presidential election. And I think the public's had it with that. And to the extent that you're now talking about an indictment of one or both of the potential candidates in the 2024 race, I just think what's gone on in the last two presidential cycles argues against having law enforcement decide who becomes president.
Yeah, I want to ask Andy McCarthy to put his punditry hat back on, take his legal hat off, and put his political pundit hat on, and wonder aloud whether or not this is the move against Joe Biden and some other potential, Do you think this is the move politically, and we're seeing a new Democratic candidate for president in 2024?
Yeah, I'm less confident about drawing that conclusion, but I think it's a perfectly fair question to ask. It's certainly something I'm wondering about, just like you are. Like, did somebody decide that he's a loser in 2024 and this is the way, to push him aside? I'd be very interested. Well, it's interesting. We know a lot more about what their top level positions are in this case. Like the Justice Department has said this did happen. They were unauthorized locations. The Biden team has said he inadvertently misplaced the documents, which is essentially a guilty plea because the standard under the statute is gross negligence. So we know all that already, but we don't know a lot of intriguing things like, where did this information come from? Who dropped the dime on all this? Why were lawyers cleaning out the filing cabinet? When you and I moved, I'm sure neither one of us, I know a lot of lawyers, but I don't think I'd retain them for, cleaning my closets out. My God, no, I don't want anyone in my closets, actually.
Not at that hourly rate. So wow, Andy. Okay, I thought we were winding it up, and we are winding it up, but I think I have a way to tie this up. But that is fascinating that you point out that this story had to make its way to the surface somehow. This story had to come forward somehow, and it does lend to this, which you describe, and I think as well, is a fair question of whether or not this is a first move against Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate for president in 2024. But I also heard you say you're not as confident in that political prediction. And I think I heard why. And so I think this is going to lead me to my last two questions. You don't believe because of the Hillary, if I'm reading between the lines, it sounds like that your prediction is because of the Hillary Clinton precedent and the DOJ's pressure to show that it's not, or begin to be not, a political organization that tips the scales, that the likely outcome is neither Trump nor Biden are indicted. I think that's kind of where I heard you leading, and therefore then that wouldn't be someone making a move against Biden as candidate for president.
Yeah, I don't mean to be hard to read between the lines, because I'd like to say flat out that is what I think.
Okay.
One of the things I'm always concerned about, Will, is, have I fallen in love with my own theory, right? You always have to put a check on. So I've always thought the Hillary precedent gave the Justice Department a very narrow margin of error, and because the cases are too similar, the Hillary and the Trump case. And I don't think they could take a body blow like the fact that now Biden is implicated in the same behavior. And then the second thing is, hearing the Biden position today, I thought they would say nothing. When you come out and say, we think that a full investigation is going to show that they were inadvertently misplaced, that's tantamount to allocuting to exactly what the Espionage Act says. It makes them guilty. So I think a good lawyer would only come out and say something like that if they were confident that if that's what the evidence shows, they're not going to be charged, which means they've made the second calculus that you and I just talked about. The evidence is sufficient. We're not going to argue on the sufficiency of the evidence. We're going to argue that the public interest does not merit a prosecution here. And it looks to me like that's where they're going, and that's why they're confident about it.
Okay, so that answered my final question, which is, if your prediction is that both essentially the Trump and Biden special counsel investigations go away, become fruitless, if that is your prediction, how do you reconcile that with what you're describing as essentially a guilty plea in public by the Biden administration? And you reconcile that by saying you believe them saying, essentially admitting guilt in public, is part of their understanding this will go nowhere.
Yeah, I think what they come out and say, Will, is there's the four corners of what the statutes say, and then there's this broader picture which involves precedent and also what's in the public interest, and they'll say that weighs heavily against an indictment here.
Well, let us both hope, Andy, that the DOJ has seen the light. And what we're talking about here is essentially an 0 for 3, Clinton, Trump, and Biden, and not 1 Trump and 2 zeros against Biden and Clinton, because that would be very hard to reconcile with the American public and their current skepticism with the DOJ.
Yeah, the country will explode. They can't do that.
All right. Awesome conversation, Andy, as it always is. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks, Will.
You too. All right. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.